This is a sew-along tutorial for the Nomad Dreamer top. You can grab the downloadable PDF pattern from our website with a link on the screen or linked below. When choosing material, you should opt for a woven non-stretch, and we recommend a very lightweight cotton that's around 65 GSM. A good way to tell is that when you flap the cotton around, you'll find that it is very floaty and catches the air and has some transparency to it. Of course, if you wanted a fabric that wasn't transparent, then you can opt for a viscose or rayon or something with a beautiful drape. Make sure you pre-wash and iron your fabric before diving into the cutting to avoid any shrinkage, especially with natural fiber fabrics. To choose your size, you want to start by measuring your shoulder width. To take this measurement, you want to start at the point of your shoulder where your sleeve seam sits, across your back to the other point of your shoulder. Then reference page 13 of your information sheet to choose your size from the finished measurement chart. The next measurement that you want to take is your bust. You should take it all the way around your back and bust at your fullest part. You want to factor in at least 2 centimeters of ease, and the more ease you factor in, the looser the top will fit around your bust area. If you do find that the size you've chosen from your shoulder width doesn't allow enough room for your bust measurement, then we've linked a simple tutorial below that allows you to change the pattern to allow more area in your bust. You will find if you simply size up that the shoulders and armholes may gape and feel a little bit big. So we always recommend just altering the pattern to allow for more bust area. It is also quite a midriff style, but you can extend the bottom of the top and also the frill if you want it to come down a little further. If you are feeling a little bit nervous about changing or altering a pattern, please don't be. Start with a toile, an old bed sheet or a doona, and you can try whatever you want, and it's definitely going to make your top fit better in the end. And you'll have a huge sense of achievement. We give back with every pattern, and you can check out how we create a sustainable future for the Badawa Pygmy people at our website madelabel.co/giving back. To cut out the pattern, we suggest you check out page 3 of your pattern, which will give you a cutting plan and how much fabric you need for this top. There are 2 ways to cut our pattern pieces. Either place on fold, where you're going to fold your fabric in half along the selvage edge and then place your pattern along the folded edge and cut all the way around the pattern except for the edge that's on the fold. And you'll see when you open up the pattern, this will give you 2 symmetrical sides of one pattern piece. The other type of pattern cutting is a mirror cut. So you can either fold your fabric in half and cut both of these pieces at the same time, always keeping in mind the selvage edge, or you can cut them one at a time. After you've cut the first one, you simply flip the pattern piece, cut all the way around it. Both of these ways are going to give you mirror versions of that same pattern piece. The other thing to note when cutting out your patterns is to make sure you mark all the notches. On this garment, you're going to need to mark on the top front panel all of the button marks. Make sure you do mark them on both pieces. On the sleeve, you're going to mark the 2 side notches, which will help you line up the inner seam. The top notch and ease marks on the sleeve. And so important is to mark which side of the sleeve is the front. It's so easy to forget to do this, but it's very important that it is done. So we suggest just pinning a label on the side that is the front to make sure it doesn't fall off. So to start, we're going to be joining the top at the side seam and at the shoulder seam. You want to pin these with wrong sides together. We're then going to join the inner seam of the sleeve. So just flip it over with wrong sides together, lining up the internal notch marks, pin in place, and you can pin the whole way up the internal seam. For sizes 4 to 12, you're going to be joining the 2 ruffles at the side seams. Make sure that you are pinning them wrong sides together. For sizes 14 to 16, to keep the ruffle cut on the selfage edge, the front pattern piece was split into 3 pieces. So you want to pin all those 3 together, and then you're going to pin that front ruffle to the back ruffle, which will be one continuous piece, again with wrong sides together. We sew all of our seams using a French seam, which we call the Frenchie, which helps with durability, and just the look of the inside of your garment is going to look amazing. So you want to start by sewing a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam along all those pinned edges. The next step in the Frenchie is to trim back all of the seams to less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 a centimeter. Once they're all nicely trimmed, then you want to open out the seams and iron them flat. Then you want to flip it over and press the seam to the outside edge. At this point, wrong sides should be facing out. Once you have ironed all your seams in place, you can fasten them with a little pin if you feel you need to. For the sleeves, as they're sewn into tubes, you just want to lie them flat to first press the seam flat. Then you're going to turn it inside out, and in that same way, you're going to press that outside seam to the edge. And once you've pressed all your seams, we're going to finish the French seam with a 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter seam. This seam should line up with a line in the middle of your presser foot. And you can see that once that is sewn, that all your raw edges are going to be beautifully encased in a French seam. And then once they're all finished, you can press them flat to one side. At this point, you should have 2 sleeves and the main part of your top, which is going to look a little bit like a vest at the moment, and finally your long ruffle in one continuous length. The Nomad Dreamer sleeve is drafted to be a little bit longer than a regular sleeve, so we're going to start by creating an elastic casing at the end so that when you wear it, you get a little bit of volume and ruffle. The first thing you want to do is measure some 1/4 inch elastic around your wrist. It shouldn't be too tight so that it doesn't strangle your wrist, and you need to leave about 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter after the point where you want to close it. Mark both the meeting point and where you want to cut the elastic. And then you can just cut it at that point. You then want to measure out and mark another piece of elastic for your other wrist, making sure that you also add the mark where it's going to close. You then want to get the end of your sleeve and fold over around 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 a centimeter and press it flat. You then want to measure your elastic. Then you're going to again roll the end of the sleeve in and make sure that you have enough room to fit your elastic through with just a little bit of room at the bottom for stitching. Then you can pin that in place and give it a quick press. Give a little double check to make sure that you have room to sew underneath your elastic, and then you want to mark an opening and a closing hole on the sleeve casing. Then heading back to the sewing machine, you're going to start sewing at that point and then end at the second point. You want to sew as close to the edge as you can. Continue to sew all the way around the edge of the casing until you reach that mark. Make sure when you do get to the end of the mark that you just give a little back stitch as well to keep everything in place. We're going to come back later in the project and finish the elastic. The first step in attaching the sleeve is to sew 2 lines of basting stitch, starting at the notch that you marked all the way around to the second notch. You want to change your stitch length to 4, and starting at that notch around 1/4 inch away from the edge, you're just going to sew a line of basting stitch. You want to continue to sew all the way until you reach the other notch that marks the end of the basting stitch. And when you do finish sewing, make sure you pull long threads. Then you're going to go back to that same notch and start a second line of basting stitch, again around 1/4 inch away from the first line that you have already sewn. So now we want to join the sleeve to the top with wrong sides together. So you want to have your top facing right side out, but your sleeve inside out with the front side facing up. And then you want to take that sleeve and insert it into the armhole of the top. Then you want to line up the top notch with the shoulder seam and pin in place. You then want to line up your bottom seams and pin them together. Take your time to make sure that you've really got them lined up the whole way down the pin. Pulling the top 2 strings, you want to gather ever so slightly just to ease that sleeve into the armhole. We use easing to make the sleeve fit perfectly into the armhole, and with this style of top you shouldn't really see any indication of gathering. It's just to get everything to fit nicely, so try and smooth everything out as you pin it along. And once you've pinned both the sleeves and they're fitting well, you're going to head back to the sewing machine and you want to sew that first part of the French seam, which is 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter, all the way around the sleeve hole. If you do have any sections of the top that you can see the material has slightly bunched, just use your fingernail to move them along so that the seam is nice and flat. You're then going to come along and trim along this line to less than 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter. Do take care that you don't snip the sleeve, and it's much easier if you leave it tucked inside the shirt. You then want to pull the sleeve so the right sides are facing out and iron that seam flat before turning the whole shirt inside out. And as we did with the other French seams, pressing that seam to the very outside edge the whole way around the circle of the sleeve. Make sure that the side seam of the top and the underarm seam of the sleeve are lining up perfectly by pinning them in place. You You may also just want to fasten the rest of the sleeve with some pins. Then we're going to return to the sewing machine and finish the French seam off with a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 centimeter seam. Then finally press both sleeve seams on both sides of the top. Then we're going to come back and insert the elastic into the casing. First, pin the elastic to the seam to make sure that the elastic doesn't get pulled through. Use a pin on the other side of the elastic to feed it through the opening in the casing. Once you've reached the end, pull the elastic all the way through and then fasten with a pin at the point that you marked where you wanted the elastic to meet. Fasten with a pin, and then returning to the machine, we're going to use a zigzag stitch to close this elastic up. The zigzag will allow that when you have stretch inside of the casing that nothing is going to break. Finally, go back and sew closed the hole in your casing. For this, you're going to need a thin piece of bias sewn closed for the hole loops, 3 buttons, button backing, and some cut bias tape to use for the facing. This is double folded bias tape that we've cut out of our fabric. To make enough bias facing, you want to cut a square of fabric that is around 31 centimeters or 12.25 inches. You want to cut strips of fabric that are roughly 3.5 centimeters or 1 1/3 inches wide. For your button loops, you want to cut a slimmer strip which is around 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch wide. The length of your strip will depend on how big your buttons are, but it should be roughly 30 centimeters or 11.5 inches long. We recommend a button with a diameter of 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch and 2 buttonholes. If you don't know how to make bias tape, then you can check out our quick video on the link on the screen and also linked below. Starting with your bias that should be sewn along one edge for your button loops, you want to make little circles that are wide enough to fit your buttons through. You should mark the point at where the button comfortably fits, leaving a tail of around 1/3 of an inch or 8 millimeters long. Once you've marked those points, you can snip your first button loop, and then you want to mark those so they're nice and easy to see, and cut and mark 2 more so you have 3 button loops with the markings on them and they are all the same size. We're going to start by tacking the button loops onto the right hand side of the top, and this should be the right side when you are wearing the top. So to do this, we want to straddle the little button loops around either side of the notches. You want to make sure that the right side of your fabric is facing up and that you are placing the loops on the right side of the fabric with the ends just dangling over the edge. We definitely recommend at this point that you try on the top and make sure that the button markings are in the right place for your body and the type of buttons that you have purchased. To start, you want to make sure that your bottom button loop is at least 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters up from the bottom of the top. You're also going to want to mark 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter in on each buttonhole marking to allow enough room for the bias binding to flip these over. You then want to line up the markings on your loops with the marking that you just made on your top and pin them in place, and the tails should just hang over the edge. Double check that your button loops are still 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter away from the edge. Then you want to tack these in place. You should be tacking these so that the button loops meet in the middle and the middle lines up exactly with the notch on your shirt. You can see once you've done all 3 that when you flip them over, that they're all going to be facing out, and this is a great time to test that the button is still fitting through them nicely. Next, we're going to move on to the button backing, for which you should have 1 cut. So what you want to do is fold the backing in half, right sides together, and give it a press. Then you want to pin this in place. You're then going to mark an opening and a closing hole, leaving a gap around 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters. You're then going to sew all the way around the outside edge of the backing. Use your needle to pivot at each corner, and when you reach your mark, make sure that you give a little back stitch and then lift up your foot, pull the string to the side, and then replace the foot at the second mark, also giving a little back stitch, and then continue to sew around the outside edge of the backing, right off the edge. You then want to turn the backing inside out, feeding all of it through that little gap. You can use a blunt object such as a chopstick to help you get those corners nice and pressed, and then give it 1 nice iron to get it nice and flat. We're now going to sew the button backing onto the left hand side of the top, which would be the left hand side when you are wearing the top. So with the right side of your fabric facing up, you want to place the button backing so it covers all of the notch marks. And you want to make sure that the little hole that you've left in your button backing is facing towards the seam side. So again, you want to make sure that the bottom of your backing is at least 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters up from the bottom, and 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter in from the sides, and mark this on all of your notches. Making sure that your hole in the button backing is on the raw edge of the top, you want to place the backing along those 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter marks on the notches that you just made. We're then going to sew a seam along the very edge of this just to hold everything in place. And you can see once you've sewn that holding line and you give it a flip, that it's going to sit out like this once the facing is all done. Then we're going to add the bias facing around the entire neckline of your top. Opening one edge of your bias tape out, you want to place those raw edges together, making sure that the right sides are both together and that it is sandwiching your button loops in between them. You're then going to continue to pin the bias facing all the way around the neckline of your top, making sure that when you do reach the shoulder seam that your internal French seam is all facing the same way. When you get to the side of your backing tape, again, just make sure that you're sandwiching that backing in between the bias facing and your top. You're going to be sewing 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter in from the side, and so you want to make sure that that is just catching the outside edge of the backing. You can also tell as the folded line of the bias tape is going to be giving you a guide as to where you're going to sew on the machine. Once everything is placed, we're going to head back to the machine and do that seam 1/4 of an inch in from the outside edge. And as we said, use that folded mark of the bias tape as a guide to where you should be sewing along the edge of your top. Once you finish your seam, you can take out your pins and just double check that your backing has been sewn inside the edge of that seam and everything is nice and secure. You also want to check that your buttonholes have all worked well, and this is also a great time to do one final check and make sure that they are all still fitting their button through them. And once you've checked everything is great, then you can go ahead and snip those extra bits of the tails off of your button loops. Now we want to turn the facing in. So the trick to this is to fold the facing down to that seam line, and then you're going to roll it over again. And you'll see your little button loops are just going to pop over to the outside edge of your seam, which is always super fun. You're then going to pin in place and continue to roll to the seam line, and then roll over again and pin in place. You want to continue this rolling to the seam line and then rolling over again, encasing all those raw edges and pinning in place all the way around the neckline of your top. And similarly, when you reach your button backing, you're going to see that once you roll it down and over again, that it's just going to flip to the outside edge of the seam, and the raw edges are all going to be encased within the beautiful bias facing. You're then going to want to give your neckline a quick press and also press your button loops and backings as well, which will help with the sewing. You can see that your loops and backings should now be fitting together like peas and carrots. You then want to head back to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew as close to the edge of that bias facing as you feel comfortable, all the way around the entire neckline of the top. And then you're going to give it one final press. Now it's time to sew those buttons in place. So you want to make sure that everything is still lining up, and then you're going to hand sew the buttons on top of the bias facing. And once you've sewn all the buttons together, just tack the very bottom of the top together so that the pieces are just kissing in the middle. We are almost getting to the end of this top, and it's time to hem the ruffle. So we're going to do a rolled hem using the iron, but of course you can always use a specialty presser foot. So you're going to press in 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter all the way along the outside of the ruffle. You're then going to come back and roll in another 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter and press that along again. We're then going to head back to the sewing machine and sew as close to the edge of that rolled hem as you feel comfortable. Just take it nice and slow and use your hands to feed through the ruffle. Once you've finished, give it one final press to make sure everything is sitting nicely. We then want to mark the halfway points on the back top panel and the back ruffle panel. You're then going to mark the 1/4 way points on both of these pieces. And you want to do the same thing on the front top panel and the front ruffle. Obviously the halfway mark is going to be where the buttons are on the front panel. We find the easiest way to do this is to fold each pattern piece in half and mark on both sides. Then you can use that as a point to fold each end in, marking the 1/4 way points on both sides as well. And you should do this on each side of your pattern piece for both the top and the ruffle. We then want to sew basting stitch on the ruffle with a break in the side seam so that there's 2 sections. Again, turning your stitch length to 4, you want to pull your strings long, and then you want to start at that side seam. and you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch in all the way around the ruffle until you reach the other side seam. Then you're going to pull the strings quite long, cut them, and start another line of basting stitch on the front, again 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. Once you've done one whole section, you're going to come back and sew 1/4 of an inch away from the first line of basting all the way around your ruffle, again stopping at the side seams. So pulling the 2 top strings of any section, you're going to gather your ruffle. As it's twice as long as the top section, you're going to need to do a fair bit of gathering, and it helps to pull from both ends and meet in the middle of each section. You then want to start by joining the halfway points and the side seams in each section. You're then going to pull or loosen the gather so that it's evenly split across this back section, joining up the 1/4 way marks and then evening out the ruffles and pinning in place. And you want to complete this over each section of the top, making sure that everything is nice and even and the side seams are matching. You're then going to finish with a French seam, starting with 3/8 of an inch or a 1 centimeter seam. Make sure that your ruffle is facing up and just slowly feed the fabric through. Trim back your top under 1/4 of an inch or a 1/2 centimeter. Make sure your frill is tucked up underneath your top while you cut so you don't nick it. Once you finish, you want to press the seam flat. Then you're going to flip it over and again press that seam to the outside edge. And just like all our other French seams, we're going to finish with 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter seam at the sewing machine once you've pinned it all in place. Just take it nice and slow, as you will have a lot of extra bulk there due to all of the ruffles. To finish, you want to give your ruffle an extremely thorough press on both sides. If you don't take this final step and really press everything in place, you can find that the ruffle looks a little bit bulky as you haven't really set in those beautiful ruffle folds. And then you're done and ready to sport the Nomad Dreamer. So